I'm very pleased to just open the fourth seminar of this year of CISMOR Seminar, and I'm very grateful to have with us today Professor Boaz Huss from the Ben-Gurion University, a scholar of Jewish studies, who already visited us several good years ago and took part in our seminar on Jewish studies in the context of Sufism and the Kabbalah and the mystical thought. And I would like to welcome him today, and I will pass the leading to Doron Cohen. Dr. Doron Cohen, please.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. Let me introduce our speaker at the seminar today. Professor Boaz Huss is the Aaron Bernstein Chair in Jewish History at the Goldstein-Goren Department of Jewish Thought at Ben-Gurion University. He is also the director of the Goldstein-Goren International Center for Jewish Thought at the same university, and the vice president of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism. His research interests include the history of Kabbalah or Jewish mysticism, although I know he has a difficulty with this term, and also contemporary Kabbalah, what's going on with it these days, Western esotericism, Jewish occultism, and alternative spiritual and new religions movement in Israel. He published many books and articles, among them a major contribution to the study of the Zohar, published first in Hebrew and later in English under the title The Zohar, Reception and Impact, published by Liverpool University Press in 2016. And more recently, he published Mystifying Kabbalah, Academic Scholarship, National Theology, and New Age Spirituality, Oxford University Press 2020, and also edited the volume The Cosmic Movement, Sources, Context, and Impact, published by Ben-Gurion University. As we heard before, Professor Huss formed good connections with Japanese scholars and with CISMOR. In 2015, he participated in our 8th CISMOR conference on Jewish studies and gave both a public lecture and a seminar lecture on the Kabbalah. You can read his lectures, his papers on the CISMOR website. And we also, since today, unfortunately, we still have to use the Zoom. He cannot come over, but still it's a happy occasion to see him with us. And later, this lecture will be on video at the CISMOR website for everyone to watch, including those who were expected to join us today but didn't. So the title of his lecture has changed a little bit from the originally intended. He is going to speak about then Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, comparative perspectives. And he will speak for about an hour or less, and then we will have time for a discussion and questions and answers. So, Professor Huss, please.
Thank you very much, Doron, and thank you, Ada, and thank you for the participants. And I'm grateful for the invitation It's good to be again in CISMOR framework, although I must say I preferred the first face-to-face visit, and I hope to visit again soon or sometimes. The title of the paper changed, but it's just a change of title, which I thought it's shorter, but it's the same idea as in the same ideas that were expressed in the previous title. These are, what I will present to you are things that I thought for a long time, but I learned more, researched more during a seminar on Jewish, Buddhist, and Hindu relations that took place this winter in Oxford, in the Center of Jewish Studies in Oxford, and this is not exactly the first time, but I'm still trying to work out and working on a paper that hopefully will come out of it. So I will be very happy for your, this is still work in progress, and I will be very happy for your input. I try not to speak too long, so we'll have a longer time for discussion. So I will upload my, okay. You see the screen, right? And if there's anything, because we're quite an intimate group, so you can stop me. By the way, if you don't mind, I prefer seeing some faces when I speak, and so if you don't mind opening video for me, it's nicer not to speak through black boxes. Okay, so I will start. In 1995, Masao Abe, the prominent Japanese Buddhist philosopher and religious studies scholar, published in his book, Buddhism and Interfaith Dialogue, a short chapter entitled Zen Buddhism and Hassidism, Similarities and Contrasts. Abe was not the first scholar to compare Zen Buddhism and Hassidism. The first to offer such a comparison was the famous Jewish philosopher and scholar Martin Buber. Abe's short chapter is indeed based to a large degree on Buber's comparisons between Zen and Hasidism. In the beginning of his article, Abe relates his own personal encounter with Buber on the occasion of meeting between his teacher, D.T. Suzuki, and Buber that took place in New York in 1955. In New York, I became acquainted with many Jewish people. The most important event in this connection was that I was invited to attend the week-long seminar at Columbia on Judaism and Christianity, at which Martin Buber was a key speaker. After the seminar was completed, I visited Martin Buber at his apartment with D.T. Suzuki, my teacher, who was then lecturing on Zen Buddhism at Columbia. It was really an unforgettable evening for me because I could join in this illuminating conversation between the two great religious thinkers of our time. In my lecture today, I would like to examine the comparison between Zen Buddhism and Hasidism, which was first offered by Martin Buber and later developed by several other Jewish and Japanese scholars. My interest, however, will not be so much in the similarities and differences between Zen Buddhism and Hasidism, but rather in the question, what are the assumptions that underlie such a comparison, and what are the motivations for comparing between these two traditions that developed in different historical periods and distant geographical areas and did not have any connections between them before the 20th century. To clarify the historical and cultural context of the comparison between Zen and Hasidism, I would like to examine and compare the modern studies of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, and the scholars who spearheaded these studies. It should be noted, and that explains the change in my title, that Hasidism is studied mostly in the framework of the study of Jewish mysticism, a term that is used to denote Kabbalah, Hasidism, and a few other related Jewish traditions. As Maurice Friedman, the American scholar and translator of Buber to English, noted, there is a similarity between the two great scholars of Zen and Hasidism that Abe mentioned in his article. And I cite, Suzuki, in his life work as interpreter of Zen to the Western world, is strikingly similar to Buber in his lifelong task as interpreter of Hasidism. There are indeed significant similarities between the intellectual biographies and the scholarship of these two scholars, as well as of other scholars of Zen and Jewish mysticism, such as Shaku Suyen, Gershom Sholem, and others. The second part of my lecture today will be dedicated to a short comparison between the modern academic studies of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, and the light it sheds on the major assumptions that govern the modern academic studies of these traditions. Allow me to begin with a presentation and discussion of the comparative studies of Zen and Hasidism. Sorry. As mentioned above, the first scholar to offer a comparative study of Zen and Hasidism was Martin Buber. Much of his essay, The Place of Hasidism in the History of Religion, which was first published in Hebrew in 1945 and in English translation in 1960, is dedicated to such a comparison. Buber's study is based mostly on comparing Hasidic and Zen tales and legends. He also compares the importance of art in the two traditions, painting in Zen and dancing in Hasidism, and notes that both in Zen and Hasidism, the relations between the teacher and his disciple is central. Following his comparison between the saying of a Hasidic rabbi and a Zen master, he says that the two answers, the Hasidic and the Zen, are almost identical in essence. Buber asserts that both movements express almost in the same language their belief that truth is found in the living experience of human existence. Buber concludes that Zen and Hasidism resemble one another more than any other religion. I know of no other religious movement that, to such an extent as Zen and Hasidism, has connected its view of the spirit with the idea of spiritual transplanting. In both, human truth, paradoxically, is not honored in the form of a possession, but in that of a movement, not as fire that one burns on the earth, rather, to speak in the language of a time, as electric sparks that are ignited in the contact of the stream. In the one place and in the other place, the highest subject matter of legend is what passes between teacher and disciple. However, Buber argues that there are also fundamental differences between Zen and Hasidism. Buber asserts that the comparison between Zen and Hasidic legends helps to clarify what is particular to Hasidism. He uses the comparison between the mystical approach of Zen Buddhism and Hasidism in order to highlight the unique and, in his view, superior position of Hasidism, which sets it apart from other forms of mysticism. The realism of Zen is dialectical. It means annulment. Hasidic realism is messianic. It means fulfillment. Hasidism, as far as I see, is the only mysticism in which time is hallowed. Of all the manifestations of the history of religion, Hasidism is the one in which the two lines meet in full clarity, the line of inner illumination and the line of revelation. Following Buber, other scholars accepted the notion that there is a significant resemblance between Hasidism and Zen Buddhism and offered further comparisons between the two movements. Jacob Uro-Teshima offered the most comprehensive comparison in his book, Zen Buddhism and Hasidism, a comparative study. Jacob Uro-Teshima, a Japanese scholar of Judaism, is the son of Abraham Ikuru Teshima, the founder of the Makoya, the pro-Israel Japanese Christian new religious movement. In his book, published in 1995, which is based on a PhD dissertation that he wrote in 1977 at the Jewish Theological Seminar in New York, Teshima follows Buber and relies much on his studies of Hasidism. However, he criticizes Buber for concentrating on the comparison between Zen koans and Hasidic tales, and argues that Buber failed to grasp the precise meaning of the koans which he quoted. Teshima argues that a mystical annihilation of the self is central to Zen Buddhism and Hasidism, and that both movements use similar practices of meditation and awareness to achieve it. And I will cite a passage from his book. Both Zen Buddhism and Hasidism emphasized the significance of the annihilation of the self. Zen Buddhism attempted to attain it through the practice of zazen, that is, meditation while sitting cross-legged, and Hasidism through dvekut and kavanah, that is, cleaving to God and intensive awareness of the divine meaning. Through full practice of zazen or dvekut, a human being is no longer just a lesser being who is in need of salvation, but is a benefactor who promotes it on behalf of all creation, like the Buddha or the Messiah. Teshima regards Zen Buddhism and Hasidism as movements of social and spiritual renewal. Teshima asserts that both movements offered a response to the spiritual stagnation of their respective religions. When Judaism and Buddhism came to a spiritual stalemate, after centuries of material growth and spiritual edification, small groups of concerned people began to reflect seriously on the situation. Realizing the lack of spiritual flexibility and freshness in the routine elaborations of rituals and doctrines, they hoped that intensive practice of spiritual discipline, zazen in Buddhism and prayer in dvekut in Judaism, would release new spiritual energies to spiritual souls. However, Teshima also notes several substantial differences between Zen and Hasidism, such as the difference between the Hasidic idea of cleaving to God and Zen's concept of looking into the ultimate reality of one's nature, and a total difference between their attitude to distracting thoughts. Several other Jewish and Japanese scholars offered comparative studies of Zen Buddhism and Hasidism. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, the Japanese scholar Masao Abe dedicated a short article to Zen Buddhism and Hasidism, similarities and contrasts. Masao agrees with Buber that a positive relationship to the concrete is common to both Zen and Hasidism. He brings several other examples of the resemblance between Hasidic tales and Zen stories, and asserts that they say exactly the same thing. However, he also criticized Buber for his limited understanding of Buddhism. In recent years, a young Israeli scholar, Ze'ev Kitzis, offered further discussions of the resemblance between Hasidism and Zen Buddhism in an article whose subtitle is "The Hasidic Rabbi as a Zen Master." The comparative studies that I mentioned aim to reveal the phenomenological resemblance between Zen and Hasidism and highlight the common elements as well as the differences between them. The common assumption of all of them is that Zen and Hasidism are movements of spiritual renewal which aim to achieve a pure religious or a mystical experience. As I said at the beginning of my talk, I'm not so much interested in the question of the resemblance and differences between Zen Buddhism and Hasidism. I am sure that resemblances as well as differences can be found between Zen and Hasidism, as they can be found between any two things we choose to compare. I am more interested to analyze the assumptions that underlie the comparison between Zen and Hasidism and the motivation of scholars to compare between these two disparate traditions. In order to discuss these questions, I would like to offer a different comparative perspective. Instead of comparing between Zen and Hasidism, I would like to offer a comparative study of the modern scholarship of these movements, focusing on Japanese scholars of Zen Buddhism and Jewish scholars of Jewish mysticism. And while I will start now the second and longer part of the lecture. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Masao Abe related in his comparative study of Zen Buddhism and Hasidism a meeting between D.T. Suzuki and Martin Buber. These two scholars played central roles in the modern study of Zen and Hasidism. I already noted that the American scholar and translator of Buber, Morris Friedman, noted that Suzuki, in his life work as interpreter of Zen to the Western world, is strikingly similar to Buber in his lifelong task as interpreter of Hasidism. In another place, Friedman observed that many people on the Western world took their understanding of Hasidism from Buber, just as they used to rely solely on the interpretation of D.T. Suzuki for their understanding of Zen. In the following, I would like to expand the comparison between Suzuki and Buber. I will argue that there is a significant resemblance not only between Suzuki and Buber, but also between other scholars of Zen Buddhism and of Jewish mysticism, such as Buber's mentor, such as Buber follower, colleague, and sometimes opponent, Gershom Scholem, and Suzuki's teacher and colleague, Shako Soyen. Furthermore, I would argue that the resemblance between the modern scholars of Zen and of Jewish mysticism exceeds their roles as interpreters and propagators of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism to the Western world. I will argue that there is a significant resemblance between the fundamental assumptions and categories that dominate the modern scholarship of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, that there are similar genealogies of these modern fields of study, and that the modern study of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism emerge in similar culture and political contexts. Before turning to examine these similarities, allow me to offer a short survey of the development of the scholarship of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism. As I already mentioned, the study of Jewish mysticism includes the study of Hasidism, which is usually perceived as the last stage of the Jewish mystical tradition. The academic study of Buddhism in general, and Zen Buddhism in particular, has its roots in the interest in Buddhism as well as Hinduism of Western Christian theologians, philosophers, and scholars in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The Western study of Buddhism, which was perceived as representing the spiritual and mystical spirit of the East, was developed in the 19th century by Western Orientalist scholars. One of the most influential Western scholars of Buddhism in this period was the German-American philosopher Paul Kraus, who propagated the perception of Buddhism as a spiritual mystical religion in his influential book, The Gospel of the Buddha, published in 1896. By the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, Japanese scholars and philosophers accepted the Western image of Buddhism as representing the mystical East and developed the study of Zen Buddhism. One of the central figures in this project was the Zen reformist Shaku Soyen. Shaku Soyen was born in 1860, was a Zen master of the Rinzai school and served as the abbot of a temple at Kamakura. He also studied at Keio University in Tokyo and traveled to Sri Lanka, where he studied Theravada Buddhism. In 1893, he was part of the Japanese delegation to the World Parliament of Religion in Chicago, where he met with the above-mentioned Paul Kraus. During the Russian-Japanese War, he served as a chaplain in the Japanese army. In 1905, he visited the United States again. He stayed there for several months and presented the lectures that were later published in his book, The Sermons of a Buddhist Abbot. He returned to Japan via Europe, India, and Sri Lanka, and continued to serve as the abbot of the temple in Kamakura until his death in 1990. Soyen's Sermons of a Buddhist Abbot, whose subtitle is Zen for Americans, was translated to English by D.T. Suzuki. In the book, which was published in 1906, Soyen discussed Buddhism from a Japanese national perspective and emphasized both its universal nature as well as its Oriental essence. The chapters of the book are dedicated to diverse topics such as Buddhist faith, Buddhist ethics, spiritual enlightenment, and Buddhism and Oriental culture. The book, which also contains a reply to a Christian criticism of Buddhism, concludes with an address that Soyen gave in honor of the Japanese soldiers who died in the 1904-1905 Russian-Japanese War. D.T. Suzuki, the disciple of Soyen and the translator of his sermons, is the best-known Japanese scholar of Buddhism in the West, who contributed most to the propagation of the notion of Zen Buddhism as pure mystical experience. Suzuki, who was born in 1870 and studied in Waseda University in the University of Tokyo, was introduced by Shaku Soyen to Paul Kraus. He resided in America for several years and worked with Kraus until his return to Japan, where he was appointed professor at Otani University in Kyoto. He gave lectures at American universities and taught for several years at Columbia University in New York, where, as you may remember, he met with Martin Buber. He also participated in the famous Eranos conferences in Switzerland. Suzuki, who passed away in 1966, practiced Zen since his student days. He, as well as his wife Beatrice, were also affiliated with the Theosophical Society. He published many books on Zen Buddhism, including his influential book, Mysticism, Christian and Buddhist, published in 1957. Similar to the modern study of Zen Buddhism, The roots of the modern study of Kabbalah and Hasidism and their categorization as Jewish mysticism are found in the work of Christian Romantic scholars of the early 19th century, especially in the work of the Christian theologian and Freemason Franz Molitor, who was the first to coin the term Jewish mysticism. The study of Kabbalah was further developed by 19th century Jewish scholars of the Wissenschaft des Judentums movement, who were opposed to Kabbalah and Hasidism. However, during the second half of the 19th century, some Jewish scholars developed a positive appreciation of Kabbalah as representing the spiritual aspect of Judaism and used the term mysticism in its emerging positive sense to characterize Kabbalah. The positive perception of Kabbalah and Hasidism and their identification as Jewish mysticism became much more prevalent in the early 20th century. One of the major propagators of this new perception of Kabbalah and Hasidism was the Jewish philosopher and Zionist activist Martin Buber. Buber was born in 1878 in Vienna and was raised in the household of his grandfather, Shlomo Buber, a scholar of Jewish studies in Lviv. Buber studied at the universities of Vienna, Zurich, and Berlin. He was active in the Zionist movement and became a well-known author, philosopher, and scholar of Hasidism. In 1938, he immigrated to Palestine and served as a professor of sociology at the Hebrew University. He resided in Jerusalem, where he died in 1965. Interestingly, in 1906, the same year in which Suzuki and Soyen published the sermons of a Buddhist abbot, Martin Buber published his first book on Hasidism, The Tales of Rabbi Nachman. The Tales of Rabbi Nachman contains a German rendition of the stories of the early 19th century Hasidic rabbi Nachman of Breslov. Buber introduced the book with a short essay entitled Jewish Mysticism, in which he offers a short presentation of the history and nature of Kabbalah and Hasidism, which he interprets as Jewish expressions of a universal mystical phenomenon. Several other Jewish scholars of the time devoted studies to Kabbalah and Hasidism, which were defined and interpreted as forms of Jewish mysticism. The main scholar of Kabbalah and Hasidism was Gershom Scholem, who is considered to be the founder of modern academic study of Jewish mysticism. Scholem, who was born in Berlin in 1897 and became a Zionist enthusiast in his youth, started his research of Kabbalah in Germany in the 1920s. He immigrated to Palestine in 1925 and became a professor of Kabbalah at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He lectured in many universities in Europe and the United States and also participated in the Eranos meetings. In 1939, he presented his perceptions concerning the significance and development of Jewish mysticism in a series of lectures at the Jewish Theological Seminar in New York, which were later published in his highly influential book, Major Trends in Jewish Mysticism. I would like to turn now and look at the resemblances between the modern scholarship of Jewish mysticism and of Zen Buddhism, and between the above-mentioned Jewish and Japanese scholars. There are several noticeable similarities between the biographies, social and cultural positions, and the academic careers of the Jewish and Japanese scholars. They all belong, more or less, to the same generation. All of them spent time in Europe and the United States, taught in Western academic institutions, and published their work in Western languages, as well as in Japanese and Hebrew. It is interesting to note that Scholem, Buber, and Suzuki participated in the Eranos conferences, and that the three scholars met each other although we have little information about the meetings that Sholem and Buber had with Suzuki. As I have already observed, there is striking similarity in the role that the four scholars played in propagating Zen Buddhism, Hassidism, and Kabbalah to the West. Much of the knowledge of these traditions and the way they are perceived and sometimes practiced in the West is based on the studies of these scholars. The Jewish and Japanese scholars and their scholarships had a significant impact also on modern Buddhist and Neo-Hasidic movements. Furthermore, the four scholars were active in national Jewish and Japanese movements, or at least supported them. Martin Buber and Gershom Scholem were active in Zionist organizations, and Shaku Soyen and D.T. Suzuki were supporters of Japanese nationalism. Beyond the similarities in their biographies and cultural positions, there are some significant common presuppositions and similar perspectives to the modern study of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism. Both the Jewish and Japanese scholars adopted the modern Western notions of mysticism and pure religious experience and used them as the main categories to describe and explain their national traditions. Zen Buddhism in the case of Soyen and Suzuki, and Kabbalah and Hasidism in the case of Buber and Scholem. The modern studies of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism that these scholars founded are based on the presupposition that mysticism and pure religious experience are universal transcultural phenomena. It should be noted that the notions that pure experience is the core of religion and mysticism is a universal phenomenon are modern ideas which were formulated in the 19th century in Europe and the United States and entail a modern ecumenical theological stance. The adoption of these concepts as the main descriptive and interpretative categories of both the academic studies of Zen Buddhism and of Jewish mysticism highlights the common cultural context in which these two scholarly traditions developed. Although Jewish and Japanese scholars adopted the characterization of Buddhism and Kabbalah and Hasidism as forms of mysticism from Western European scholars, they rejected some of the Western perceptions of their cultures and developed their perceptions and interpretations of Japanese and Jewish mysticism as a response to these Western perceptions. Thus, the Japanese scholars rejected the image of Buddhism as passive and antisocial. The Jewish scholars, on the other hand, rejected the prevalent Christian assumptions concerning the materialistic and legalistic nature of Judaism and its essential incompatibility with spiritualism and mysticism. It also should be noted that the Japanese and Jewish scholars that accepted the idea that mysticism is a universal phenomenon emphasized the unique features of Japanese and Jewish mysticism and regarded their national forms as mysticism as superior to that of other religions. As we have seen above, Buber claimed that Hasidism, which he regarded as the peak of Jewish mysticism, was the only form of mysticism in which inner illumination and revelation meet in full clarity. Similarly, Soyen asserted that Buddhism, and especially Zen Buddhism, provided the most reasonable view of mystical truth and provided the most effective methods to attain spiritual enlightenment. Suzuki also emphasized the uniqueness of Zen Buddhism that sets it apart from other forms of mysticism. Another common element in the study of Zen Buddhism and of Jewish mysticism is the adoption and adaptation of an Orientalist perspective in the study of the two traditions. Both Jewish culture and Jewish culture were labeled, studied, and imagined in modern Western discourse as Oriental. in the framework of the major dichotomist of Orientalist discourse, the West was defined as modern, rational, progressive, and materialistic, while the East was perceived as pre-modern, irrational, underdeveloped, and mystical. Jewish and Japanese scholars adopted this Western Orientalist perspective, although they emphasized the positive characteristics which were associated with the East and inverted the negative value attached to the Orient. However, they accepted the major Orientalist dichotomy between East and West. The leading Japanese and Jewish scholars of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism adopted the romantic Orientalist image of the mystical and spiritual East and emphasized the spiritual and experiential aspect of their Oriental national cultures. Thus, Shako Soyen dedicated one of the chapters of the sermons of the Buddhist Abbot to Buddhism and Oriental culture. Martin Buber developed the notion of the Oriental essence of Judaism in his famous article, Judaism and the Spirit of the East, which was first published in 1912. The notion that spirituality and mysticism were central in their culture because of its Oriental nature were repeated by many other Jewish and Japanese scholars. The final common element that I would like to discuss is the national perspective that governed the study of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism. I have already mentioned the involvement of the Jewish and Japanese scholars in national movements, and that although they regarded mysticism as a universal phenomenon, they emphasized the unique national characteristic of the Jewish and Japanese mystical traditions they studied and propagated. Soyen and Suzuki, as well as other Jewish Japanese scholars, developed the study and practice of Buddhism in a national context and described Zen as the most developed form of Buddhism, which is connected to the national Japanese character, to Japanese aesthetics and art, and to the samurai moral code. Thus, for instance, D.T. Suzuki asserted that Zen represented the essence of national Japanese culture and emphasized the difference between Japanese monistic and mystical culture and the materialism and dualism of the West. Similarly, Buber and Scholem regarded Jewish mysticism as an expression of Jewish national spirit and related it to the Oriental nature and spirit of Judaism. Martin Buber described Jewish mysticism as one of the great manifestations of ecstatic wisdom, which reveals the hidden reality of the folk soul of Judaism. Gershom Scholem regarded Jewish mysticism as the vital power of Judaism that enabled its national survival during its exile from its homeland. Both Jewish and Japanese scholars accepted also the notion that mysticism and pure religious experience are opposed to ritualistic and legalistic petrified religious institutions, and regarded Zen Buddhism and Hassidism as liberating spiritual renewal movements that express the feeling of the common people. Some of the Jewish scholars and Japanese scholars I discussed used in certain periods of their lives an ethno-racial national rhetoric. I have already mentioned that Shako Soyen, who served as an army chaplain, concluded his sermons with a eulogy to the Japanese soldiers who died in the war, and included in his sermons a lecture on the Buddhist view of war. At the same period, Martin Buber gave his lecture on Jews and Judaism, in which he exalted Jewish blood and race. Later, Buber retracted from these opinions, as well as from his militaristic enthusiasm at the break of the First World War. I would like to conclude. In the first part of my lecture today, I examined the comparative studies of Zen Buddhism and Hasidism, which Jewish and Japanese scholars offered. I have noted that the presumption that these comparative studies were based on, as well as the major conclusion that the comparative studies reach, was that both Zen Buddhism and Hasidism were movements of spiritual and social revival, which were based on and aimed to achieve a pure mystical experience. In the second part of my lecture, I offered a different comparative perspective in which I compared between the modern scholars and modern scholarship of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, concentrating on the intellectual biographies and works of four scholars, Shako Soyen, D.T. Suzuki, Martin Buber, and Gershom Scholem. I have noted the similarities between the biographies and cultural positions of the great modern scholars of Jewish mysticism and Zen Buddhism, whose research supplied to a large degree the basis of the comparative studies I examined in the first part of the lecture. The comparison between Jewish and Japanese scholars highlights the similar cultural and political context in which the academic study of Zen Buddhism and Hasidism developed. As we have seen, Japanese and Jewish scholars adopted the modern categories, mysticism and religious experience, that were developed by Christian scholars and theologians, applied it to their cultures, and interpreted Jewish and Buddhist traditions according to these modern concepts. The Jewish and Japanese scholars accepted the Orientalist image of the mystical East and regarded Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism as expressions of the Oriental character of their cultures. Jewish and Japanese scholars were active in national revival movements, identified Zen Buddhism, Kabbalah, and Hasidism as spiritual, mystical revival movements, and present them as central components of their national cultures. Finally, I would like to emphasize that although there are significant resemblances between the modern study of Zen Buddhism and Jewish mysticism, there are also significant differences between them. These similarities are dependent on the differences between the local traditions which were identified as mystical, on the different geopolitical locations of Japanese and Jewish culture, and on the different modes of encounter, appropriation, and resistance to Western Orientalism. Although the two cultures, Japanese and Jewish, were identified as Oriental, there are very significant differences in the Orientalist gaze on Japan and on the Jews, and in the ways that Jews and Japanese encountered, rejected, and/or appropriated the Orientalist images. Further studies of the history of research of Jewish mysticism and Zen Buddhism will help to reveal the unique and specific aspects of the links between nationalism, Orientalism, and mysticism in each of them. Thank you.